There is a detail from Judy Garland's home life that, once you hear it, you can never quite forget. Two of her young daughters, still just children, worked out a secret system. A doctor had warned the family that if their mother took more than 2 of her sleeping pills in a single day, it could kill her. So the little girls learned to sneak into her room, find the prescription bottles, quietly empty the pills out, and refill them with aspirin. They had to time it carefully. Guess how often they could get away with it? Because it was, as one of them would later write, a matter of life and death, with no time to learn on the job. They were doing this at an age when most children are still learning to ride a bicycle. That was the childhood behind the rainbow. The world knew Judy Garland as Dorothy, the sweet-faced girl who sang Over the Rainbow and became one of the most beloved entertainers in the history of American film. But her own children knew a very different woman, a mother of dazzling warmth and humor, who was also, tragically, consumed by the addictions that the Hollywood studio system had planted in her when she was barely a teenager. Judy Garland had 3 children, and every single one of them grew up inside that heartbreaking contradiction. Loving a mother they also, from a shockingly young age, had to try to save. And when Judy died in 1969, at just 47 years old of an accidental overdose, she left those 3 children to carry an almost impossible inheritance. Not just her staggering talent, which all 3 of them possessed, but her demons too, the vulnerability to the very addictions that had killed her. It is one of the cruelest things a parent can pass down, not through any fault of their own, but simply through the tangled combination of genetics and environment, the biological predisposition, and the childhood spent marinating in chaos. Judy's children did not just lose their mother. They inherited the very thing that took her, and each of them would have to spend a lifetime reckoning with it. Their names were Liza, Lorna, and Joey, the 3 children of Judy Garland. And what happened to them in the decades since they lost their mother is a story of extraordinary talent, of inherited pain, of survival, and of a fierce, unbreakable love between siblings who had been through something almost no one else could understand. Let's begin with the eldest, the one who became a legend in her own right, and who nearly followed her mother all the way down. Liza Minnelli, the daughter who became a legend. Liza May Minnelli was born in March of 1946, the daughter of Judy Garland and the acclaimed film director Vincente Minnelli, Judy's second husband. From the very beginning, she was Hollywood royalty, the child of a legendary star and a brilliant filmmaker. And it was clear almost from the start that she had inherited a double dose of her parents' gifts. She could sing, she could dance, she could act, and she had something more than talent. A kind of electric, vulnerable magnetism that made audiences unable to look away from her. But her childhood, for all its glamour, was anything but stable. Liza grew up as her mother's daughter, which meant growing up inside the chaos of Judy Garland's turbulent life, the hospitalizations, the addictions, the marriages that collapsed into vicious arguments, the terrifying nights. From an astonishingly young age, Liza became less her mother's child and more her mother's caretaker. By her own account, by the time she was 13 years old, she was functioning as her mother's nurse, her doctor, her pharmacologist, and her psychiatrist, all rolled into one small girl. She has written about how Judy began confiding her deepest fears and resentments and angers to her when Liza was only 5 years old, laying an adult's emotional burdens onto a tiny child who was in no way equipped to carry them. This is the reality behind the fairy tale image. Liza Minnelli did not have a childhood so much as she had a very early, very frightening apprenticeship in trying to keep her mother alive. Psychologists have a term for what happened to children like Liza and her sister. They call it parentification. The reversal of the natural order in which a child is forced to become the parent, to manage the adult's emotions and crises. And even, in this case, their medications. It robs a child of the very thing childhood is supposed to provide. A sense of safety, a feeling that someone bigger and stronger is in charge and will keep them safe. Liza never had that. From her earliest memories, she was the one holding things together, watching her mother with a vigilance no 5-year-old should ever have to muster, bracing for the next emergency. That kind of upbringing shapes a person profoundly, and it helps explain both Liza's extraordinary drive and resilience and the deep well of anxiety and need that would later make her so vulnerable to the same escape her mother had sought. And despite all of that, or perhaps in part because of it, she poured herself into performing, following her mother onto the stage. She made her mark early, appearing on her mother's television variety show, and then she exploded into a genuine superstar entirely on her own terms. Liza Minnelli became one of the most celebrated entertainers of her generation. She conquered Broadway, winning multiple Tony Awards. She conquered television, winning an Emmy. She conquered film, winning the Academy Award for Best Actress for her unforgettable performance in the 1972 musical Cabaret, playing the doomed, dazzling nightclub singer Sally Bowles in a role that remains one of the defining performances in movie history. And she won a Grammy as well, making her a member of the rarest club in show business, an EGOT winner. One of the very few people ever to win all 4 of those major awards. She had, in the most literal sense, stepped out of her mother's enormous shadow and become a legend in her own right. That achievement is worth pausing on, because it is genuinely rare for the child of a legend to escape the parent's shadow at all, let alone to build a legacy that stands entirely on its own. Most children of the very famous spend their careers being compared unfavorably to their parents, forever the lesser echo of a greater name. Liza did something almost no one manages. For an entire generation, she became the more famous, more visible star. So much so that many younger fans knew Liza Minnelli first, and only later discovered that her mother had been the great Judy Garland. She had inherited her mother's talent and then multiplied it, forging a persona and a body of work that were unmistakably, triumphantly her own. It was a staggering accomplishment. But the very intensity that fueled that success sat right alongside the vulnerability that would nearly undo her. But she had also inherited something darker, and it nearly destroyed her. When Judy Garland died in 1969, Liza was just 23 years old, and the loss devastated her completely. She has said she cried for 8 straight days, and in the immediate aftermath, thrust into the role of family matriarch, planning her mother's funeral, trying to hold her younger siblings together. She was given a prescription for Valium to help her cope with the overwhelming stress. It was meant to be a temporary comfort. Instead, it was the beginning of a decades-long battle with addiction. The very demon that had killed her mother now passed down to her daughter like a genetic inheritance. Liza herself has called it a final, terrible gift from her mother. There is something almost unbearably poignant in the way it began. Liza did not go looking for drugs out of recklessness or excess. She was handed them, by a doctor, as medicine, to help her survive the trauma of losing her mother, at the exact moment she was being crushed by grief and responsibility. It was in a sense the same trap that had caught Judy decades earlier, pills offered as a solution, as help, as something a trusted authority figure said would make things better. What began as a one-day blessing, in Liza's own words, soon turned into a habit, then a full-blown addiction. The parallel to her mother's story is chilling and exact. Judy had been handed pills by the studio to help her perform. Liza was handed pills by a doctor to help her grieve. And both women found that the thing offered as help became the thing that nearly killed them. Her struggles played out, painfully, in public over the years, through overdoses, through multiple stays in rehab, through the very substance abuse she had spent her childhood trying to protect her mother from. There is a haunting symmetry to it. The little girl who emptied her mother's pill bottles and refilled them with aspirin grew up to fight the same addiction that had taken her mother. For a long time, she could not even admit the problem to herself, telling herself that she did not really have a drug problem, that her drinking and her pills were something less than the full-blown crisis they clearly were. The same denial that trapped so many people in the grip of addiction. At one especially frightening moment in 1984, when Liza was hospitalized in New York after an overdose, her sister Lorna, desperate for help, reached out to their mother's dear friend Elizabeth Taylor, who had herself just been through treatment at the Betty Ford Center. Taylor stepped in to help, one of 2 moments when the legendary actress personally intervened to try to save Liza's life. The families of these old Hollywood stars were bound together by the same struggles, and they tried, again and again, to pull one another back from the edge. And here is the triumphant part of Liza's story, the part that matters most. She survived. Unlike her mother, Liza Minnelli found her way to lasting recovery. Today, in her late 70s, she is many years sober, and she has spoken openly and bravely about her long journey, hoping that her honesty might help others facing the same battle. In a recent memoir, she laid bare the whole story: the childhood, the addiction, the recovery, with the same wit and warmth that made her a star, insisting that recovery is not only possible, but can lead to a genuinely joyful life on the other side. Her personal life carried its own private sorrows alongside the public triumphs. Liza was married 4 times, to a string of men that included the songwriter Peter Allen and the director Jack Haley Jr. But none of those marriages lasted. And, in one of the quieter heartbreaks of her life, she never became a mother herself. She desperately wanted children, and she suffered several miscarriages over the years, a grief that those close to her say she carried deeply. It is a poignant footnote to the whole family saga that the woman who had spent her own childhood mothering her mother, and who by all accounts would have been a wonderfully devoted parent, was never able to have the family she longed for. The chain of the Garland bloodline, in Liza's branch, ended with her. She has faced serious health challenges in her later years, and she lives a quieter life now than in her glittering heyday, cared for by close friends, and living, by her own accounts, at peace. But she is here. She made it. The daughter who nearly followed her mother into the darkness instead found the light and became living proof that the inheritance of addiction, however powerful, does not have to be a death sentence. In interviews, she has spoken about still feeling her mother's presence, saying that she and Judy still, in a sense, talk to each other every day. After everything, the love between them endured, outlasting even the pain. But Liza was not the only one of Judy's children to inherit both the talent and the torment. Her younger sister walked a strikingly similar path, and became in many ways the family's storyteller and its fiercest guardian. Lorna Luft, the keeper of the flame. Lorna Luft was born in November of 1952, the daughter of Judy Garland and her third husband, the producer and manager Sidney Luft, the man who had helped engineer Judy's great comeback in the 1954 film A Star is Born. As Judy's middle child, Lorna occupied a difficult and often overlooked position. The daughter who was not the famous eldest sister and not the baby of the family, but who nonetheless carried the full weight of growing up inside that extraordinary and painful household. Her parents' own marriage was a stormy one, passionate and volatile in equal measure, full of love and full of conflict. And Lorna grew up amid all of it, watching 2 strong-willed people who adored and wounded each other in roughly equal measure. And like her older half-sister Liza, Lorna spent much of her childhood as one of her mother's caretakers. She was there for the hospitalizations, the crises, the terrifying uncertainty of never knowing what state her mother would be in from one day to the next. She and Liza shared that burden, 2 young girls trying to manage the unmanageable, taking turns watching over their mother, learning to read the warning signs, bracing together for the next emergency. It forged between them a bond that, however complicated it sometimes became, would ultimately prove unbreakable, because they were the only 2 people on Earth who had lived through exactly that particular childhood, side by side. Lorna has spoken with real insight about their mother, describing Judy not as the tragic figure the public imagined, but as a woman who was, above all, a victim of the studio system that had hooked her on pills as a teenager to control her weight and her energy and her sleep. Lorna has said that the studios gave her mother the drugs that would eventually kill her, but that the same brutal system also gave Judy the ability to channel her enormous talent and to pass that talent on to her children. A real double-edged sword, she called it. Lorna, too, inherited the family gift, and she built a solid career of her own as a singer and actress, performing on concert stages, appearing in films like Grease 2, and working steadily in theatre and television. She never reached the stratospheric heights of her sister Liza, but she carved out a genuine and respected career, and she found something perhaps even more valuable, a role as the family's memory keeper and truth-teller. In 1998, Lorna published a memoir titled Me and My Shadows, a candid and moving account of what it was actually like to grow up as Judy Garland's daughter, the love and the chaos, the warmth and the heartbreak. The book was adapted into an acclaimed television miniseries, and it stands as one of the most honest portraits of the real Judy Garland ever created, told by someone who had lived it. But Lorna's inheritance was not only the talent and the memories. She, too, struggled with the family's vulnerability to addiction, walking a hard road of her own before finding her footing. And she has faced other serious trials as well. In 2013, Lorna was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she went through treatment that same year, facing the disease with the same resilience that has defined her whole life, and coming through it. She has been open about all of it, her mother's struggles, her own, the illness, because she seems to understand that honesty is its own form of healing, and that hiding the truth only feeds the stigma that she believes contributed to her mother's death. Lorna has said, powerfully, that she believes her mother would have lived far longer had she been battling addiction in a more understanding era, one that treated it as an illness to be healed rather than a shameful secret to be hidden, rather than in the shaming, secretive climate of the 1960s. It is one of the most important points anyone has ever made about Judy Garland, that she died not only of the drugs, but of the silence and the shame that surrounded them, a silence Lorna has spent her life trying to break. Today, Lorna Luft lives in California with her second husband, the musician Colin Freeman. She has 2 children from her first marriage, a son and a daughter, and she has become a grandmother several times over. She continues to perform, to write, and above all to protect and honour her mother's legacy, becoming perhaps the most devoted guardian of the real Judy Garland's memory. When a controversial biopic about her mother was released, it was Lorna who spoke out about which portrayals felt true and which did not, always fighting to make sure the world remembered her mother as a full human being, not just a tragic cautionary tale. She has also spoken with tender honesty about her lifelong relationship with her sister Liza, acknowledging that the 2 of them have had their ups and downs, their periods of distance, but insisting that they always find their way back to one another, because their family, forged under the intense glare of public scrutiny, shares a bond no outsider could ever fully understand. 2 sisters, then, both of whom inherited the talent, the trauma, and the strength to survive it. But there was a third child, the baby of the family, and his path took him in a very different direction, away from the spotlight almost entirely, into a quieter and more private life. Joey Luft, the son who stepped back. Joseph Wiley Luft, known to everyone as Joey, was born in March of 1955, the youngest of Judy Garland's 3 children and her only son, the second child of her marriage to Sidney Luft. As the baby of the family, Joey grew up in the same turbulent, love-filled, chaotic household as his sisters, and like them, he was pulled into the family business from an early age. As a small boy, he appeared alongside his mother and sisters, including on a memorable Christmas episode of his mother's television variety show in 1963, where he sang a song and where, he later recalled, the show's living room set had been designed to look exactly like the Luft family's own living room, a poignant blending of their real life and their performed one. Joey clearly possessed the same musical gifts that ran so powerfully through his family, but unlike his sisters, he ultimately chose not to pursue the spotlight. Perhaps having witnessed up close what fame and its pressures had done to his mother, he made a deliberate decision to step back from the center of attention and to build a quieter life. He studied photography and sound, and he found his place, as he once put it, more behind the camera than in front of it, working on various productions, several of them tributes to his mother's enduring legacy. It was a telling choice. In a family where the spotlight had been both the source of all the glory and the root of so much of the pain, Joey opted for the other side of the lens, for the quiet, unglamorous work of craft rather than the exposure of performance. There is real wisdom, and perhaps real self-protection, in that decision. Joey had grown up watching the machinery of fame chew up the people he loved most, watching his mother be adored by millions and yet destroyed by the very industry that adored her, watching his sisters step into that same blinding light and struggle with its costs. He seems to have concluded, quietly and early, that he wanted no part of it, that a life lived out of view might be a life better protected. And so he built exactly that, a private existence largely shielded from the public eye, and by all accounts he found in it a peace that had eluded so many members of his family. Joey has lived the most private life of Judy Garland's 3 children, largely out of public view, and relatively little is known about his personal affairs, which is clearly how he prefers it. But he has never disappeared entirely, and he has never stopped honouring the mother he loved. In 2014, he stepped, briefly and touchingly, back into the light, debuting a one-man show at the Pasadena Playhouse dedicated to his mother, a heartfelt tribute from a son who had spent most of his life quietly out of the frame. He has spoken warmly about the real Judy Garland he knew, insisting, as his sisters have, that despite the tragedies of her life, she was not a tragic person to be around, that he remembers having a great deal of fun with her when it was just the family together, away from the cameras and the crises. That testimony matters, coming from the child who had the least to gain from the spotlight and the least reason to burnish the legend. When Joey says his mother was full of fun and love in private, you believe him, precisely because he has spent his life wanting nothing from that famous name at all. There is something quietly moving about Joey's choice. In a family defined by fame, by the relentless pursuit of the stage, he looked at all of it and decided he wanted something else, something calmer and more his own. He is proof that even the children of the most dazzling legends can choose privacy over spotlight, peace over performance. And he remains a devoted brother and son, appearing alongside his sisters at important moments, always ready to defend and celebrate the woman the 3 of them loved above all else. Which brings us to the thread that ties all 3 of these lives together. The thing that matters most in the whole story, which is the bond between them. The bond that survived everything. To understand Judy Garland's 3 children, you have to understand that they are, in a very real sense, the only 3 people in the world who share a particular and profound experience. They are the only 3 people who could call Judy Garland Mom, who lived inside that specific mixture of overwhelming love and overwhelming pain, who spent their childhoods trying to hold their brilliant, fragile mother together, and who then had to survive her loss and carry her legacy forward for the rest of their lives. That shared experience created a bond between them that has endured through everything, and it has not always been easy. Liza and Lorna, in particular, have had a complicated relationship over the years, marked by periods of real closeness and periods of distance and tension, the ordinary frictions of 2 strong, talented sisters made more intense by the extraordinary pressures of public life. But as Lorna has said so beautifully, they always find their way back to one another. Their family, lived out under a microscope, is a strange one, she has acknowledged, but the love underneath the strangeness is real and durable. When Liza was at her lowest, hospitalized and in danger, it was Lorna who fought to save her. When their mother's memory has needed defending, the siblings have stood together. They have shown up for one another, again and again, across the decades. And they have shown up publicly, too, at the moments that matter. In 2014, all 3 of them, Liza, Lorna and Joey, appeared together at the Academy Awards for a special 75th anniversary tribute to The Wizard of Oz, the film that had made their mother immortal. There they were, 3 siblings in their 50s, 60s and 70s, standing together to honor the woman who had given them life and given them so much talent and given them so much pain. It was a powerful image, the 3 surviving pieces of Judy Garland's heart, united in their love for her, standing in the very heart of the Hollywood establishment that had both immortalized and destroyed their mother. Whatever that industry had taken from Judy, it could not take this. The 3 children who still stood together in her name, decades after her death. Because that is, in the end, what binds them. Whatever their individual struggles, whatever the distances that sometimes grew between them, all 3 of Judy Garland's children have remained fiercely protective of their mother's memory. They have spent their lives insisting that the world see her not just as a tragedy, not just as a cautionary tale about addiction and Hollywood, but as the vibrant, funny, loving, extraordinarily gifted woman they actually knew. They have pushed back against portrayals they felt were unfair or exploitative. They have shared the real stories, the happy ones alongside the painful ones. They have become, together, the keepers of the true Judy Garland, the only 3 people who can say, with authority, who she really was behind the legend. In a world that has always been quick to reduce their mother to her worst moments, her three children have stood as a living, loving correction, a reminder that the real Judy Garland was so much more than the sum of her sorrows. What their story leaves behind. Judy Garland died in June of 1969 at the age of 47, and the immediate cause was an accidental overdose of the barbiturates she had been dependent on for most of her life, an addiction that traced all the way back to her teenage years. When studio executives at MGM had first given a young girl pills to keep her thin and energetic and compliant. She was one of the most gifted entertainers who ever lived, and she was destroyed in large part by a machine that valued her talent far more than it valued her life. That was the inheritance she left her three children, along with her love and her gifts, the long shadow of the same addiction that had claimed her. And here is the remarkable thing. All three of them survived it. All three of them are, as of today, still living, which is itself no small miracle given the demons that ran in the family. Liza, in her late 70s, an EGOT-winning legend, many years sober, having conquered the very addiction that killed her mother. Lorna, in her early 70s, a performer, an author, a breast cancer survivor, the devoted keeper of her mother's flame. And Joey, quietly living his private life, stepping out now and then to honor the mother he adored. Three children who were handed one of the most difficult inheritances imaginable, and who found ways, each in their own fashion, to carry it without being crushed by it. When you look at old footage of Judy Garland singing Over the Rainbow with those enormous expressive eyes, it is easy to see only the tragedy, the fragile star doomed by her demons. But her children insist, and they knew her best, that the tragedy was never the whole story. There was so much love in that household, so much laughter, so much genuine joy in the moments between the crises. And the proof of that love is walking the earth today, in three people who, despite everything, despite the addiction and the loss and the impossible weight of that famous name, grew up, survived, loved one another, and spent their lives making sure the world remembered their mother as she truly was. There is a larger lesson in the Garland family story too, one that reaches beyond this single famous family. It is a story about how the damage done to one generation gets passed to the next. Not through any villainy, but through the simple, sorrowful mechanics of inheritance. The way a child absorbs a parent's pain, the way trauma and vulnerability travel down a bloodline. Judy Garland was, herself, a victim, a talented child, fed pills by a ruthless industry, before she was old enough to protect herself. That harm did not stay contained to her. It rippled outward and downward, into three children who had to spend their own lives fighting the same battles she had lost. And yet the Garland story is also, ultimately, a story about how that chain can be broken. Liza broke it, finding the sobriety her mother never could. In doing so, she and her siblings transformed their inheritance from a pure tragedy into something more hopeful, a testament to the idea that even the deepest family wounds can, with enough love and enough courage, begin to heal. Judy Garland could not save herself from the machine that made and then destroyed her. But she gave her children two things that outlasted the tragedy: her breathtaking talent and a love fierce enough to bind them together for the rest of their lives. Liza, Lorna, and Joey inherited the demons, yes, but they also inherited the light. And in surviving, in loving each other, in guarding her memory with such devotion, they have honored her in the truest way possible, not by pretending she was perfect, but by insisting that she was real, and that she was loved, and that she loved them back with everything she had. The subject of addiction touched on in this story is a serious one. And if you or someone you know is struggling, please know that help is available and that recovery, as Liza Minnelli's own life proves, is always possible. If you found this story moving, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more of these fascinating and human stories.